In Mark chapter 9, something pretty funny happens. Now, we don't notice how the Gospels can be comedic at times because we're not reading the Gospel mostly for yucks. I mean, we're looking for spiritual nourishment and insight. But sometimes we miss the underlying humor of a scene. Mark chapter 9 is kind of funny. Jesus and the disciples are walking towards Capernaum. And the 12 disciples are arguing which one of them is the greatest. So this is typical. 12 dudes together. Somebody's going to go for alpha male, right? And so they're arguing who's the greatest. They get to Capernaum, and Jesus turns around to them and says, "What have you been arguing about?" And immediately, all the disciples sort of put their hands in their pockets and look down at their shoes, maybe kick the dust a little bit. Some alpha males, no one's willing to say what they were talking about because now they're embarrassed. And Jesus actually must have known what they were talking about because now, so he starts to school them. He kind of sits them down and first tells them, the last will be first. So he goes right at the issue to get rid of all these ideas of pecking orders and who's better. But then he continues with like an object lesson. He brings in a child. So he just kind of, he's kind of bringing it to him, right? The scene's a little bit funny, but it's talking about an issue that's not funny at all, about how competitive we are or the type of status anxiety we have and how we create pecking orders, always putting somebody higher and somebody lower. Alain de Botton, this great Swiss philosopher, he wrote a book about status anxiety. And in fact, he believed that our culture now is saturated with a status anxiety. What he's talking about is some basic worry that you're not living up to the success ideals in your culture. There's some notion of success, and it can become a tyranny over you. And status anxiety is worrying you haven't quite lived up to it, and worrying that you might slip down a rung, or thinking that somehow you always have to fight for dignity and respect in a culture like ours. So the status anxiety takes hold. And he begins to examine what are the causes of status anxiety. And this is interesting. Well, this is poignant. He thinks there is a basic lovelessness in our culture now. That there's a type of love where each of us needs to feel like an object of value. That's really what love is in this form. It's valuing somebody. And we need to feel valued, to be seen, like our opinions matter. But he believes that now there's a lovelessness, that our society will let people sort of disappear and we won't think they're of much worth. Lovelessness. But he also goes on to talk about how there's a snobbery that has taken hold in our culture. So snobbery is when you react to just symbols of achievement, but not really looking at the person's character. You react to what brands they're wearing or other symbols as a snob, but you won't really appraise the character of the person, their personhood. He thinks there's more and more snobbery these days. Recently, I was on Michigan Avenue, that great shopping street in Chicago, and my wife and I walked into the Louis Vuitton store. So this is like the flagship Louis Vuitton store in the Midwest, and it's incredibly beautiful. I was stunned. You walk in the store, the lighting is perfect, the displays. I was enthralled. The whole place was like a work of art. But I was walking in shorts, and we weren't going to buy a $30,000 Louis Vuitton bag. We were just looking. And I had in my mind as we walked in that store that scene from Pretty Woman. Do you remember that? Where she's not respected. She doesn't look, well, she looks like the prostitute she was playing. She looks like a street person, and how snobbish the shopkeepers were. Do you remember that scene, how snobbish they were? So I thought I'd walk into that scene. Actually, in that Louis Vuitton store, we were just in shorts and we told them we weren't buying, but all the folks there were so anxious to just say, oh, you can look at anything, you can touch, we'll bring out samples. They were very attentive. They weren't snobs at all. However, the very notion of these bags operates on a certain snobbery, that if you carry a $30,000 bag, you're somehow of higher merit. We know that's mere snobbery. A person's merit's not based on their handbag. Oh gosh, did you see them replay that Pretty Woman scene in Yellowstone? I think it was like the second season of Yellowstone, where the Native American woman in the family was shopping at a super expensive place. That is, well, you got to YouTube it. It's kind of a brutal scene, but it goes to exactly the snobbery that I'm talking about. In our culture, a snobbery makes people invisible. Everybody needs to be seen as someone who is important. Alain de Botton, this philosopher, also believes that our expectations have shifted dramatically in this culture, that status anxiety takes place because in a modern capitalistic free market society, and after the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, everything has changed now. There's this idea that you have a possibility to go rungs up the ladder, that in the past, a poor person had no chance to ever make more money, or people didn't have a chance to get more education. But now there's this expectation that you should work your way up. You should get a lot of education. You should achieve things. You should make money. And so there's this interior judgment that takes place, wondering, why haven't I moved rungs up? And it can all become just grinding. Status anxiety. The disciples were arguing about who's greatest. We do that kind of thing all the time. I said it was a funny scene. It's also a deeply sad scene. I would add two other causes to status anxiety in our culture. One is how just naturally competitive we've become. Man, I grew up as a kid. I was competitive about everything. And me and my best friend, we competed about everything. Every moment we were together, we were making up games to compete and see who would win. And we were in different high schools by the time we got to high school. And we were playing sports in our high schools. And we still would compete against one another. He's my best friend. But we were in constant competition. Who was doing better at football or baseball or basketball at their school? One day I had done really well in my recent game at my high school. We met up. He had done horribly. And I remember a rush of delight that he had done so horribly. And I remember thinking, what kind of person am I that feels good that he failed that day? Because I'd become so competitive, looking for any edge. I thought, what kind of person would be happy that their best friend had just failed? I suddenly was struck with what competition can do if you let it take hold of everything. I'm still a competitive person. But that memory, it's right at the front of my mind now, to never wish someone ill for someone or someone to fail. But it's not just competition, I think. Also, we fall into comparison. So in our culture, we're competitive and we're constantly comparing ourselves to each other all the time because there's so many images with social media and pictures, and we're saturated with these ideals, and then we imagine, how do we measure up to someone else? And these endless comparisons make for a miserable life too, and it increases status anxiety. So I thank God for Jesus in Mark chapter 9, who reminds us that, so Jesus has a big agenda. First, he wants to obliterate pecking orders, which is awesome. The last will be first. He's trying to completely subvert these notions of somebody is higher than another. There's a complete equality of souls in Jesus' perspective. So look what he's doing. He's obliterating pecking orders. He's talking about everyone being of inherent, infinite worth. But there's more subtle things going on too. He wants you to approach life with an intrinsic self-worth. You don't need to compare yourself to others. Could you measure yourself, not yourself compared to others? And there's a basic moderation. Everything doesn't have to be a frenzy. Jesus' style of life is a type of moderation, a type of intrinsic self-respect, and then a love for everyone. Ultimately, Alain de Botton was touching on a lovelessness in our society that don't see people of value, not everyone. Well, Jesus brings us to that greater love. Wherever you are right now, you are of infinite value. You're not part of a pecking order. You're a soul, and I thank God for you.